times. I'm really glad to see everyone here today. This, it's really invigorating to see this level of turnout and interest in something that is becoming, I think, a really important emerging issue here in Toronto, and that is the preservation of the heritage buildings, the schools that have been built over the years by the city, and that now are under pressures from whether it's development or just benign neglect or deliberate neglect. It's a really good thing to have this conference. So what I'm going to be talking about is essentially the buildings from 1950 to 1965. So this is a smaller segment, building on what Alex talked about. And what it's looking at is going to be what were the wider cultural forces, the socioeconomic forces that created this era in architecture. Some of the precedents, both in North America and globally, that were drawn upon by the architects. And as well, three specific examples that I think really epitomize what this era was about. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the context. And, did I turn it off accidentally?
No, I think it's in the slide. One more.
Okay. So first of all is the, just for clarification up front, in terms of talking about the geographic area, in this period, 50s, 60s, the Toronto Board of Education, as it was called at that time, its boundaries were within the old city of Toronto. So places like North York, Scarborough, East York, and Etobicoke, those were all separate municipalities that had their own separate school boards and had their own separate building programs. So this is dealing with what was the old city of Toronto. And at this time, beginning after the Second World War, you had a confluence of a bunch of things happening very quickly. One was the baby boom, for sure, where suddenly you had vastly increased numbers of school-aged children in the city of Toronto who needed a place to go to school. Secondly was a great deal of immigration to Toronto as well. Much of that went toward the city center. Third was just a great deal of deferred school building. During the Depression and during the Second World War, there was very little or no school building underway. So by 1950, you had arguably a 20-year backlog of structures that needed to be built. And at the same time, you also had a rapidly changing architectural scene, where the ideas of what schools could be were changing. So this, you might recognize this. This is a school by Richard Neutra, Los Angeles in the mid-30s. And this, certainly Toronto never built anything quite to this openness, but this is something where I think it illustrates the new ideas in schools and in learning and in teaching that were coming to fruition during this time, where you had a much more democratic, student-centered model of pedagogy, much less of the schools in rows with the stern teacher at the front, much more of an interactive, democratic voice of the child. That type of context in terms of education was becoming the standard. So then the reaction was, okay, we built these large imposing buildings for many years. How can we better accommodate that kind of new pedagogy? So in Toronto, the Toronto Board of Education in this period, 50 to 65, these are the three key people, and as Alex pointed out, the specific authorships are difficult to determine. As anyone who's worked in an architecture office knows, there's no one person, but essentially it was led by Frederick Etherington, who was a long-time longtime head. He retired in 1965, which marks the end of the period I'm covering, and at that point he had spent 42 years with the Toronto Board. So he'd spent his entire career essentially, and he had been the author, or to varying degrees, author oversight of many of the 20s and 30s buildings that Alex had shown earlier. Gordon Frittenberg was the chief deputy architect, and Peter Pennington was the lead design architect. And many of the three buildings I'm going to show in particular, I think really epitomize the design approach that he brought to schools. And this was a quote from Peter Pennington published in the early 60s. And this, I think, really sums up what their philosophy was about. And that's taking things that were typically ordinary, that could be ordinary, and make them extraordinary. You know, the idea of taking these small, what could be very small details, a door handle, you know, a pattern on a wall, a ceiling, and making them really something exceptional, something interesting, something beyond something that just fulfilled a technical need or a functional need. So precedents. So as I said earlier, there was a huge amount of change in schools at the time in terms of model of teaching. And concurrent with that was the need to change the actual physical environment. So this is the Corona Avenue School we saw earlier from Richard Neutra. So here is what you could call kind of an extreme example very early on. This was an experimental school associated with UCLA. And here you've got the transparency between inside and outside. You've got children out in the landscape, in nature. You have children in chairs arranged in a circle. So this is a very different model from what would have been the predominant method at the time. This is a building, famous school by Arne Jacobsen in Denmark. And once again here, you've got the idea of the integration between the inside and outside. Each classroom overlooked a courtyard, and each courtyard had its own special tile pattern and its own special piece of art included. So there was a sense of a very distinct identity for each and every school within a cohesive overall scheme. And as you can see from the clerestory windows, the idea of bringing sunlight into the center of the classroom. So rather than having just a band of windows where you had glare on one side and relative darkness on the other, you had a much more even, natural lighting. This is probably the most influential school to come out of the period, Crow Island School of Eli Saarinen, Eero Saarinen's father, and Perkins and Will. This is a model for the Sunnylee School in Etobicoke here, and pretty much the template for the standard school to come in North America. So what you've got here, certainly if you contrast that with the Gothic or the Art Deco schools that would have come in previous decades, you can see there's a much lower profile. It's much more home-like in terms of scale. You've got things like the large pillar marking the entrance, so it's very clear where to go. You've got a warmer, variegated brickwork rather than classical columns and those types of symbols of authority. Here you can see there's individual blocks for each classroom, so there's an identity for each one. It's not just a simple strip. And there's also outdoor art. You've got sheltered courtyards with what were, in this case, decorative ceramic tiling. Interiors here, you can see there are no, desks bolted to the ground in rows. You've got actual tables and chairs, much like a domestic dining room or breakfast table arrangement. You've got much larger windows. So all of these were all the currents at the time. And this is another model now. I mean, Peter Pennington was trained in Britain. Much of the architectural world in Toronto at the time were people of British extraction, so there was more so than a connection with what was going on in the US. There was probably a stronger connection with what was going on in England. In England, under the Labour government, there was a very strong push to democratize education, coming out of the Depression, coming out of the Second World War, in this period of austerity in England. There was an idea of saying, look, we don't have a lot of money, but let's be creative and let's create, good environments for education. And the Hertfordshire City Council, County Council, architects were one of the most prominent and best known of that at the time, and certainly Peter Pennington would have been aware of these kinds of schools. You can see the same kind of design themes we saw earlier with the North American schools here as well. This is perhaps what might be considered a bit of an outlier. This is Hunstanton School by Peter and Alison Smithson. This became hugely publicized at the time. This is kind of the Mies van der Rohe interpretation of the school, similar to buildings he'd done at MIT. So this was a less popular interpretation, but it was certainly one of the schools of thought out there at the time. The other kind of overarching design motif or design influence that was really prominent here in Toronto was the Festival of Britain. So the Festival of Britain was really kind of the coming out or the rebirth of Britain after the Second World War. It occurred in 1951, at a time when there was still rationing, there were material shortages, there was still a lot of austerity within Britain as they emerged from the Second World War, the destruction from that, and also the debt that had been incurred. So the Festival of Britain was designed as a celebration. It was along the Thames River in downtown London. And the themes that came out of this were things that we see reflected later in the Toronto School Board schools. So you've got things like a much greater use of color than typical in the modern period at the time. You've got a much greater use of varied materials, lots of contrasts of color, material, scale. You've got what was, in many cases, very sort of fine, delicate detailing rather than big, chunky expressions of things. You had an almost, I think you could say a delicate or very fine-grained execution of things. And just an overall sense of fun and whimsy and optimism and a sense of looking to the future. And you can see that reflected here. These are similar things. You've got a much more lightweight construction, things that are just more colorful, meant to be lighthearted and forward-looking. So these are the three Toronto schools I'm going to focus on. One is Lansdowne Public School, 33 Robert, as Alex showed. So that's on Spadina Circle. Obviously the Parkway Vocational School, the one we're sitting in right now. And finally, number 3, the Davisville Public School and Metro Toronto School for the Deaf at Davisville, which is now the subject of what will, it seems at this point, inevitably be demolished and replaced. So to start with the Lansdowne Public School, I mean, one thing that I think certainly strikes me about this, and if those photos of the Festival of Britain were in color, you would certainly notice it, is this almost like a carnival or a festival appearance to this. You've got lots of different materials, lots of different planes, lots of surfaces, lots of things going on here. You've got a tall smokestack. It's actually freestanding. It rises right out of the ground. It's striped like a candy cane, so it takes something that's potentially utilitarian. It makes a feature out of it. You've got these rocket-like spears shooting up into the sky, both around the main classroom block and around and over the entrance as well. And then something as prosaic as a gym, which can easily be just a simple block, a monolithic block, it's really animated. It's got a sawtooth roof, it's got varying advancing and retreating panels of different brick, and along the ground level, it's got classrooms. So this is a plan, and you can see how it's laid out here. The main classroom block is a 9-sided circle. So once again, there's like the carousel reference here. And that links to the Gymnasium block. This is ground floor here, so you're looking at the kindergarten blocks on the left-hand side. And then those two elements are linked together by an administration block in the middle. So this is what the 9-sided circular classroom block looked like. And you can see there's bright color. I mean, this is on a higher scale. It's 3 stories. But you can see you've got the bright color, you've got larger windows, you've got a sawtooth roof, and you've got those very space-age vertical spears shooting up. So there's a sense of animation here that this is a fun place to go. It's not a place where kids are kind of incarcerated for 7 hours a day. This is actually a fun place where cool stuff happens. I mean, as a child during the space race era of the 60s, I think, that kind of imagery, there's a look to the future there, a sense of, optimism that there is a better future lying ahead. And it's a very effective model, and it actually has some practicality too. What this is the roof is actually suspended. The vertical spars support horizontal beams, which in turn suspend the roof, and that actually allowed it to be expanded vertically quite easily if it was required. This is a gymnasium. So those are the kindergarten classrooms on the ground floor. So rather than, one thing you'll note with this is it has floor-to-ceiling windows. So the idea is that for small children who, as well as not being very tall, they also tend to spend a fair amount of time on the ground. The idea is that you've got nature, the outside world, literally just outside the window at arm's reach, as it would be. So sense of integration there, a sense of, instead of my classroom is 3 stories up, my classroom is rated eye level with me as a small child. And you can really see that transparency here. The other colors that were used were this marine blue and a bright lemon yellow. So you had variations on the 3 primary colors that really brought a sense of animation to the school. There's a close-up of the candy cane. So this school we're standing in now, this is the Parkway Vocational School. This was a really ambitious project for them. This was intended to be a vocational school with a lot of really thorough levels of equipment in it, and things that weren't necessarily necessary, but were an expression of a vote of confidence in the future of children who in many cases, were not academic superstars. But through this vocational school, I think one of the most important things about this is the idea of a message that, even if you're not great in school, we still value you, we still believe in you, and we're going to invest this time and money in creating a facility that will help you gain your place in society. So where we're sitting right now is in this rear leg. So this was the cafetorium, combination cafe and auditorium. And below us is a quite large swimming pool. The front block, which faces onto Danforth, was the auto shop, these sculptural ramps ascending and descending from either end. And then the middle section was administration and other trades, and that included everything from a training in being a barber to tailoring to machinery to a wide variety of trades at the time. And this gives you an idea of just the complexity of the interiors here. And one thing is that these schools were all built to a very high standard. You probably know this just looking around. You've got a lot of materials that were not, and design features that were not cheap. This building and others of its era, they were built with a cost per square foot that was roughly equivalent to a major downtown office tower at the time. So they were not built on the cheap. They were very much an investment in the future, social investment, collective investment in the future of children as productive, integrated members of society. And that was a message that I think was transmitted through not only the design quality and the material quality, but also through the craftsmanship of how these buildings were executed. This is below us here. This is a swimming pool. So the sense of this too, for this school particularly, it was, as well as providing training facilities, it was also very much a home away from home for people. The idea that, this would be a place where you could come, you could get away from your household, and you could actually almost have what you could call a spa-like experience, perhaps, where you had recreational facilities, you had social facilities, you had essentially a whole ecosystem around you here to help you succeed. So this is out toward the front. On the right there is a elevated bridge that connects to the auto shop facilities, which are on the left. So one of the stylistic things here, you can see there's definitely an organic influence, perhaps through Oscar Niemeyer. The concrete forms and organic shapes. And this hallway, if you get a chance to walk through it, it's quite amazing in that you're walking down what's a relatively dark passage with these inset blocks of light shining into it. It's really quite an experience. This is the rear of the building. Once again, you can see the variety of materials, planes pushing in and out, breaking up what could be a mass into smaller chunks. So again, you can see here that, the contrast, there's an animation and energy to these buildings. This you might have walked by on the way in. This is facing east. So this is a patio, essentially, a sheltered, elevated patio off the cafeteria, overlooking what was originally a garden below. So the idea, this faces east, it faces the morning sun. This would be a gathering place for students, for teachers, a place where you could socialize, you could talk about your trade, you could learn about what other people are doing, and just have a much more engaging experience than would be possible. And then finally, we've got the Davisville School. So this is going to be dealt with in more detail, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But this is a significant building that has much use for future adaptive reuse. Unfortunately, that is probably not going to be realized. And you can see this was quite celebrated at the time. This was a big deal. With major openings, there was a book produced. And here are some of the original photos. You can see it has not changed very much over the years. And as you can see, certainly space is not a problem around this building. So the question would be, what can be done with this? And I think the summary of the closing statement here would be that these buildings, that they're of value, they're of heritage value, that they're of just simple functional value. And there's a legacy there. There's a useful asset that I think could be leveraged and taken care of in a better way, and that could serve the community well for coming generations. So, thank you.